Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we have an exciting video, another recipe that I'm bringing to you guys. I have a phenomenal chunk of meat here. I have a choice brisket that I picked up from Kroger today, and I'm excited to show you guys how I go about cooking this brisket. It's going to be a little bit longer video potentially because this does take a while on the smoker to cook. I'll go ahead and tell you, I'm not a professional when it comes to cooking briskets, but I want to show you guys how I go about cooking this brisket. So stick around, we're going to break this thing open, and we'll go ahead and show you guys how to start getting it trimmed up before we throw it on the smoker. Okay, so we've got the brisket out of the package, and a quick orientation to your brisket. Your brisket is going to have two different sections. So your muscle, your meat is a muscle. So basically you're going to have two different groups of muscles in this cut of meat. You're going to have your flat, which runs, so if you'll pan down here, I'll show you. Your flat's going to run this direction, and then about halfway up your brisket, you're going to have the point. And the point is going to be the combination of two different muscles. So your grain's going to switch from running this way to running this way, all right? And so what you want to make sure of is that your flat gets trimmed properly because it's a thinner cut of meat, obviously, right here, compared to this massive chunk of meat called the point at the top. And I'm going to show you guys real quick how I go about trimming this brisket up, as well as showing you hopefully a time lapse of the whole process of breaking this down, but I don't want to take up your time with the entire process because it'll take me probably 10, 15, maybe even 20 minutes to cut this perfect. So what we're going to do is, your first goal with your flat is going to be to trim off as much fat as possible. Obviously here you can see there's fat marbling here as well as on the back. There's a lot of fat, and we'll get to breaking that down in just a second, but I want to show you guys kind of on this side. What we're going to do is we're going to come through here. Make sure you have yourself a really sharp knife. I've already sharpened this one this evening. And you're going to come through here and just take off as much fat as you can, leaving as much meat behind as possible, okay? Obviously this is a big chunk of meat, so don't be afraid to take a little off, but we're trying to get all this fat that's not going to render down right off to allow the seasoning to get to the meat, all right? So I'm going to go ahead and work on this side, and I'll bring you back when I flip it over and show you how to trim this point up where all this fat cap's at, all right? So let me finish this up, and I'll bring you back when I get to this point, okay? Now that I've got this flat end trimmed up, it's not perfect, but you're just trying to get all of that, as much of that fat off as possible so you get down to the meat. But now I want to show you guys the fattiest part of this cut of meat, which is the point, all right? So Anna's going to pan down here, and we're going to see. What you're going to see here is you have some major chunks of fat sticking off of this, and it's really firm fat too. So like if you go to grab it, it's not going to even budge. And so your goal is to cut as much of this off as possible without, so if you were to imagine the shape of this being a rectangle all the way down, your goal is not to cut into the meat too much. You want to leave some of that fat and make it even all the way around, but your goal is to take as much of this chunky fat off because none of this is going to render. No matter how long we leave it on the smoker, this fat still is going to be nasty fat that's not going to render into that juicy fat that we like to have inside this brisket, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work on trimming all of this fat to make it even with the rest of the brisket and trimming off as much as I can. And then you're also going to see this brown meat right here. So if you come over here, you're going to see it really well. On the top, it has really nice red meat, and then you have brown meat, and that right there is just simply from being stored in the package. A little bit of air potentially gets in there and turns that brown. So what we're going to do is once we get it all shaped up, we're going to come along and just trim off all of this brown meat because we don't want to cook that meat. We want to just cook the fresh red meat, all right? So I'm going to work on taking this fat cap off and then this brown section of meat all the way around, and then we'll come back and I'll show you guys on the flip side, the actual true fat cap, how we're going to trim that up, okay? So stick with us, and we'll bring you back in just a few minutes. Okay, so I flipped this piece of this brisket over, and this is called the fat cap. So this is, as you can see, this entire side is covered in a thick piece of fat. And so what we're going to do is we don't want to take the entire fat cap off because this is the fat that we're going to want to render down into our brisket, okay? So we trim the other side pretty lean, but this side is basically designed to protect the meat from the fire. but it also is going to render down into that meat. So what we're going to do is we're going to come through here, and this is where you really want a sharp knife, is you want to come through and just kind of skin this off the best you can. You can take it nice and slow. You don't have to take it all off at once. But you want to bring it down to, I would say, 1/4 of an inch of fat left between the meat and the top, so that it has a chance to render. If you leave this big chunk of meat on, it's not going to render right. It's going to totally be this nasty fat on top. But if you cut it down to, say, 1/4 of an inch or a little bit bigger than that, it's going to allow that thin layer of fat to render as we leave this in the smoker overnight. And it's going to let that fat just become juicy and seep down into this meat and turn it into one of the best briskets you've ever had. So that's the goal here, is not to take the entire cap off. If you have a few spots where you accidentally nick the meat and go too low, it's not a big deal. But we want to leave at least a good little bit of a layer on this side so that fat is allowed to render during the smoking process. Alright, so now that we've got this brisket trimmed up the way we want it, I want to give you guys just a few quick tips. As you can see, there's a ton of fat on the side here that I've trimmed off of this brisket. So the first thing I want to encourage you to do is don't be afraid to trim your brisket properly. If you leave all this on, it's going to, number one, take forever to cook. But also, this fat that you see is not going to render properly if you leave it on your brisket. So we want this nice thin layer of fat on here so that it renders properly and we're able to have the fat content that we need on this brisket. The second thing I want to encourage you to do is take your time when you're trimming your brisket. If it's your first or second time, definitely slow down and learn the process, learn your cut of meat, and take your time cutting the fat off and trimming the way you want to, because this is what's setting you up for success when you pull your final product off the smoker. If you leave too much on, it's not going to finish. It's going to take longer than you need to cook. So take your time trimming this up. You're not going to be disappointed on the back side if you take an extra 20 or 30 minutes on this side trimming it properly. And if you need to, go back, watch the section of my video where we trim this, or go find another video on YouTube where they show you specifically step by step how to break these down, and spend some time learning how to break down a brisket and take your time when you're doing it. So we're going to season this up. Today I'm using the Holy Cow Meat Church seasoning. This is one of my favorite brisket rubs. The reason I like it is because it's a very coarse seasoning. It's not very fine. Some of the seasonings you get are really fine and more powder-like, and that's not what you want on your brisket. You want your brisket to be able to accept all the smoke that's coming in from that smoker. And if you use a really fine, dust-like seasoning, at least in my experience, it tends to clog the pores up a little bit, and you don't get as good of a smoked seasoning or smoked taste on your brisket. So this coarse seasoning allows those pores to stay open while still allowing your seasoning to do what it needs to do on your brisket. But it allows that brisket to take that smoke in and then have a phenomenal crust on the outside with the seasoning. Like I said, this is one of my favorites. Y'all seen me use it in a couple other videos. But we're going to season this thing up and we're going to get it straight out of the smoker. So y'all stick around and we'll show you how to season it up. Alright guys, so with your seasoning, don't be afraid to put your seasoning on this brisket. This is a phenomenal cut of meat, and it's really a thick cut of meat. So as long as you have enough seasoning on here, you're not going to over season this brisket, okay? So what I'm doing is I'm just evenly coating the meat side of this. And what you want to do is you want to get every single side possible. So get your fat cap, all of that. You're going to season every single side of your brisket. You want a nice coat on this because this is going to be what creates that hard crust and that bark that you want on your smoker, on your brisket when it comes off the smoker. So
it's the best part.
It's absolutely the best part of the brisket. So make sure you get a nice heavy seasoning, and with this seasoning, it's got that black pepper in there, and it's going to create that dark crust that you want along with the smoke that gets imparted into this meat. So we're going to finish seasoning this up, and then next time you see us, we're going to be sticking it on the smoker. But this is going to be one of the best briskets you guys have ever seen, and you guys are just going to have to hang on and see how it turns out. Alright, so we're out here by the Pit Boss. We got the Pit Boss fired up, 225, this is what we've got it set on. It's a little chilly out here, so we want to make sure it's running somewhere between 200 and 225 for our internal temp on the smoker. What we're going to do is we're going to sit this brisket right in the middle, but what we're going to do is I'm going to face the flat end, or the flat of my brisket, towards the left side of my smoker, because this is my cooler end. This is going to cook faster than my point, and I want my point facing my right side, so where the smoke's coming out, because that's going to be pulling all of my heat to this side. That's the hot side of my smoker. So I want my thicker side of meat cooking on my hot side because it's going to cook more evenly at that point. Another tip is make sure the fat cap on your brisket is facing up and not down. A lot of people you see online will tell you to face the fat cap down so it protects the meat from the fire and the heat below. But what I found is that just totally lets your grease or your fat render out of your meat. Instead, if you flip it up and let your fat cap be on top, that fat then renders down into that meat and makes it so much more moist and juicy when you slice it up at the end. It creates a better product in the long run. So fat cap's going to be up. The point's going to be towards the hot side, flat. It's going to be towards the cool side, and we're going to let it start smoking for overnight. It's going to be multiple hours, probably closer to 12 or 14 hours in the smoker. We'll see where it ends up when we get done. But I'm going to throw this on the smoker real quick. It's still kind of coming up to temperature, but it's not going to hurt to get on a few minutes early. So we've got it turned, our point, fat cap up. We're going to set that joker right there. We've got our brisket ready to go. We've got some lights set up out here. It's kind of dark, so I'm hoping you guys can see that. But I'll bring you guys along with me throughout the night as I check on this brisket and kind of give you just a short update as we move throughout the night on how the brisket is coming up, all right? So stick around and we'll see how it turns out in the morning.
All right, you guys, so we're coming up on 11 hours. This brisket's been going all night long. Sorry for the shadows. I got the lights turned on. The sun hadn't come up just enough yet for no lights. But as you can see, the fat's starting to render. Not quite. You want to kind of render that fat until your finger just kind of sinks into that fat without any resistance. And then what I did was I started spraying the meat, any meat that's showing. I went ahead and started spraying that a few hours ago just to keep this from burning. So you want to spritz it. I use a mixture of a little bit of apple cider vinegar and beer is what I use because it allows that beer to evaporate more slowly than water. So it allows that cooling effect on that meat so it doesn't burn as quickly, all right? So you want to spray all of that meat that's showing right here and anywhere around the sides. But we're sitting at almost 11 hours. It's getting really close to having that fat rendered where I want to, and then we'll wrap it once we hit that point. We are running at about 180 degrees internal temperature. We're wanting to shoot for about 205 or maybe even 210. So I'll keep you guys up to date, but we're sitting at 11 hours right now.
Hey guys, so we're sitting at about 8:30 in the morning. As you can tell, you can probably see my breath. This morning it's a little chilly out here, but we've been going in this smoker with this brisket for just over 12 hours. We put it on about 8 o'clock last night, and it's getting close to where we want it, so we're gonna go ahead and pull it off and wrap it. What I do is a lot of people will say to wrap it at 165 internal temp, but for me, I go off the fat render on the top. If the fat's not giving under my fingers and not very loose, if it's still firm, then you're not going to get the style brisket that you want. So I go until that fat is really loose and really soft on top and gives under my fingers. And then when it hits that point, that's when I pull it off and wrap it, because that's when I know that it's getting close to where I want it. So this is actually sitting at about 189, 190 internal temp, which is about 10 to 15 degrees away from where I want it. And so we're getting close to the end, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull this off, wrap it, and then throw it back on here for the last 10 to 15 degrees that I want it to go, okay? So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna pull it off the smoker, take it inside, and show you guys how to wrap it in the butcher paper to finish out the process of cooking our brisket. All right, let's pull this thing off real quick. It's looking wonderful.
we go, guys. It's looking good. We're gonna take it in and wrap it. It's been going for just over 12 hours now. So what I'm gonna do is, you want to use this butcher paper to wrap your brisket. Some people say to wrap it around 165 internal temp, but I tend to go for that fat rendering on the top. I go until I feel that fat giving under my finger, because if you wrap it before then, your fat's going to stop rendering as quickly. And so honestly, I'm sitting at about 190, 185, 190 internal temp right now, and the fat's getting close to where I want it. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it for the last 10, 15 degrees that I want it to go. When you wrap this, what it's going to do is it's going to allow that bark to not harden as much, but also soften up a little bit. So it's okay at this point if your bark is a little tougher than you think you would want, because this is going to allow it to kind of steam in this paper just a little bit, but it's not the same as aluminum foil, where aluminum foil is going to totally steam that brisket and you're going to lose the bark that you've got on the outside, whereas with the butcher paper, it's going to allow some of that steam to dissipate off of this brisket, which is going to allow your bark to stay a little more crunchy, a little more hard like you want it. So I use this, I got this at Academy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to roll out 2 sheets, and then I'll show you guys how we're going to wrap this brisket up in here and put it back on the smoker for the last couple hours that it needs to go. Alright, so we're going to roll this out. This. Alright guys, so now that we got our paper rolled out, what we want to do is we want to put our brisket fat cap up, just like that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to slowly wrap this brisket in this paper. So what you want to do is, we actually want to go a little further there. Wrap it like this. And it's going to be messy, guys, but just go with it. Try to keep it as centered as possible. I give it one flip like that, and then kind of rotate both sides in. And back it off as best I can. And get one more. There. Then I'll fold it like this and fold it up. There we go, guys. So what I did was I folded it, folded the ends in, folded it again, and then folded the rest of it up underneath. And the reason I did that was I still want the fat cap facing up towards the top, and so you want to keep orientation of where your fat cap's at all times. So now we got the fat cap on the top. It's wrapped in this butcher paper, and we're going to stick it back on the smoker, and it's going to finish up the last 10-15 degrees until it's ready, until it is probe sensitive. So in other words, you're not feeling any resistance with that probe going in and out of your meat. So let's get that back on the smoker so we can finish up cooking. Alright you guys, cannot beat the smell of a smoker in the morning. What we're going to do is we're going to simply still orient your point back towards the hot side. Make sure everything's wrapped up nice and tight. We're just going to let it finish cooking until we get the internal temperature that we want. And that's how you wrap your brisket to finish cooking. Alright, so our brisket's done, but the last thing I want to show you guys is my favorite thermometer. What you're going to do is you're going to come over here, and the way you're going to know it's done is what I said earlier, which is probe tenderness. So you're going to stick that probe in there, and there should be no resistance besides the paper. Alright? This is going to show us we should be sitting around a little over 200, if not 205.
Take just a second. There we go, 200. Probe tender, check down here. Probe tender, no resistance. So we know that this brisket's ready to go. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna pull this off. We've got a cooler right here. So we're gonna put it in the cooler. But before we put it in the cooler, and I'll explain what the cooler's for in just a second, we're gonna let it sit out here until it comes to 180. So we're gonna let it drop naturally, temperature-wise, quickly from about 200 to 180 degrees. That way it doesn't keep cooking. But we're gonna set it in the cooler for minimum of 2 hours. Minimum of 2 hours will allow that moisture to kind of absorb into the brisket, so that way it's nice and tender and juicy and you don't lose all that moisture when you cut it. But if we put it in at 200 degrees, it's going to keep cooking because this cooler acts as like an oven or an insulator. So we want to let it get down to about 180, that way it just slowly keeps it warm and doesn't keep cooking. So we're going to throw this brisket in the cooler in just a second, but for right now, we're just going to pull it and let it sit right there, and we'll keep checking it every couple minutes to make sure that we don't go under 180. But when it hits 180, we'll drop it in this cooler and it'll sit for 2 to 4 hours depending on how long I let it sit, but a minimum of 2 hours is what you want to do. That way you have just let those juices redistribute throughout the meat before you cut it. So we'll bring you back, show you dropping it in the cooler, and then next thing you guys are going to see are going to be us cutting it in the kitchen. So hang on, you guys. Alright, you guys, so it's been 3 hours since we put the meat in the cooler. Obviously, if you wanted to go longer, you can. The only thing I recommend is not to let it drop below 140 degrees internal temperature on your meat. That's when bacteria potentially can start growing again. So if you're going to let it sit for a longer period of time, mine's getting just right around that 140 range right now at 3 hours. So if you're going to go longer than that, you may have to either fire up the oven or fire up the smoker again. Throw it back on at like 200 degrees for 30-45 minutes, just checking it until it gets back up around that 180 mark. Throw it back in the cooler and you're good for another 3 or 4 hours, all right? But you want to keep it above 140 and below 180 is kind of that cooler temperature you want to stick at. So we're going to pull this. I think it's going to be perfect. It's going to be ready to go. So we'll pull it out, put it on the cutting board, slice it, see how it turned out, and see how it tastes, all right? So come on down here. We're going to pull it out of the cooler. I've got my gloves. I'm not sure how hot it's going to be. You can still feel the heat coming off of this thing. So all I did was I wrapped it up in my butcher paper like it was coming off the smoker, set it directly in there on the cooler. Sometimes you'll get a little liquid that comes out of it. It's totally fine. Just wash the cooler later, all right? So we're going to pull this out. Right here. Come right on over to this cutting board. Now this can be the messy part. As you can see, there is grease everywhere from leaking out of that brisket. But it is all good because that's what we like to see. All right. There, you guys, is a
so
beautiful
good
looking brisket. So we're gonna lift this up. We'll pull this wrapping out from underneath it, and we'll get to slicing. All right. And Phoebe, you can get your head out of the cooler.
Get your head out of the cooler.
We almost didn't have a brisket because Phoebe tried to pull it off of the shelf when I had it resting earlier. So we had to almost didn't have a brisket for a video, but. Alright, so the brisket's out, we got all the wrapping out from underneath it, and this right here is how you know your brisket's done. It's not stiff, it's floppy. When you're holding it, it wants to bend over your hand a little bit. You can tell that brisket's done, alright? So I'm going to pull these gloves off, now that we've got it on the cutting board. And I like cutting with a serrated knife. Hardcore Carnivore is the knife I use, got it from Academy. The serrated knife just allows for the meat not to shred too much, because you normally want to try to get nice slices off of it. If your meat's a little overcooked, it might shred just a teeny bit, like pulled pork. Not necessarily the way you want it, but I'll be honest with you, it eats the same way. So I have never had an issue with it. But let's go ahead. The way that I cut this, we start on the flat, and the flat you're going to always cut against the grain. So like I said, the grain's running this direction on the flat, so we're going to slice against that grain. This is going to add to the tenderness of your meat. When we get to about right here, the halfway mark, I told you there's two muscles that kind of intertwine here. So what you're going to do is, instead of slicing this direction, when you get about halfway, you're then going to switch and you're going to start slicing this way because your grain's going to be running this direction. Okay, so that's how you would slice your brisket. If you're new and you forget which side's which, you can make a little slice before you cook it right here to where it's flat, and that tells you exactly where you need to start cutting from, okay? So I'm going to cut it right in the middle, see how it looks, and then we'll start slicing it from our different directions, all right? So let's see how this brisket turned out. Oh yeah, look at that. Nice and good bark on the bottom.
That looks so good.
So juicy. If I wasn't doing a video, I wouldn't be squeezing this because it's just squeezing all your juice out of your meat. But so nice, and this is your point, which is going to be a little bit of your fattier side. There you go. And you got the fat cap right there, so it didn't render all the way, but we can pull that off. It'll eat just fine, all right? All right, let's slice it up and give it a try, all right? All right, so let's go ahead and slice this bad boy right here. There's that smoke ring. Look at that. All right, so we'll pull that off and let's get a nice slice right here. There we go. Look at there, y'all. Even that thicker cut of meat, that thicker slice is still falling over your finger. If it wasn't done, it'd be stiff and it wouldn't want to do that. But right there, it's nice and wiggly. Beautiful smoke ring. We're just going to pull that apart. All right, let's see what it tastes like. Oh wow, the flavor is phenomenal. It's definitely not overcooked. In fact, it could have potentially gone maybe a teeny bit longer in the smoker. But I'll go ahead and tell you, this side right here on your flat is going to be a little more. If it's going to be tough or going to be a little dry, this is going to be the side that it's going to get a little dry because it is that really thin side, so it cooks quicker. But you get down here to this point, and it's the bigger cut of meat. It's going to be really juicy. It's going to be really tender. So don't be afraid if your flat's a little on the dry side or a little tough, because this is going to overcook quicker than your point's going to. All right. And some people like it different. If you're cooking for a group of people, some people like it really well done. Some people like it a little less. So it's good to have a kind of variety of different donenesses through your brisket, all right? But the flavor is great, and my helper down here is growling, asking for a taste. So let's see. Let's go ahead and give them a taste, see what they think. There's Phoebe May. Maggie. Oh, yeah, we like brisket. All right, y'all. Let's see. You know it's good when you keep going back to take bites of it.
I wouldn't know.
No. Let's see. I guess we'll give our camera lady a taste. Here we go.
Oh yeah, that's good.
All right, let's give one slice right here, just to show you guys kind of what the point's going to look like.
It's my favorite part.
So you can see right here, it's already kind of shredding a little bit at the bottom, which is totally fine. It will eat perfectly the same.
Oh, that looks so good.
So see, you got that really big fat layer in there, and it literally just pulls apart. So even though it's a little more done on that flat side, you're not going to be able to beat that point where all that fat cap really does render down in there.
Mm.
Great flavor.
Oh yeah.
Alright you guys, well, we'll wrap this video up because obviously we're about to eat some brisket. We won't make you guys sit here and watch us eat it for the next 10 or 15 minutes. But I hope you guys learned something out of this video. I absolutely love cooking briskets. It is a learning opportunity to learn how your smoker works and how you cook this specific cut of meat. It is a little more on the finicky side. It can dry out quickly, but once you figure it out, it's going to be a crowd pleaser. Put the work in on the front side, trimming it up, spending time spritzing it, putting it on the smoker. This one smoked for right at 14 or 15 hours, I believe, and so it is the perfect doneness. So spend that time prepping, spend that time on the smoker, and I promise you, you will not be disappointed with the end product. So if you guys like this video, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bells. We've got a couple more recipe videos coming out here in the next couple days. So I hope you guys enjoy this recipe. these recipe videos. I enjoy cooking. I enjoy using our stuff outside, the Blackstone and the Pit Boss. So stick around to the next video, and we will see you guys there. Thanks, guys.